The air vents were rattling. The neon vacancy sign outside was clicking on and off. Something thin shifted behind the dust-coated curtains of room 108. The motel sat 3 miles off. Interstate 64, a low cinder-block structure with a collapsing ice machine and a front office that smelled of warm toner and rain-soaked carpet. Locals said it hadn't seen a reservation since the late 80s, back when the owner disappeared and the sheriff sealed a single room without explanation. The padlock rusted into its hinge. No one touched it again. 2 weeks ago, during a routine foreclosure inspection, a county maintenance worker found the door ajar. The lock hadn't been cut. It lay on the floor, intact, as if it had somehow slipped free. Inside, the wallpaper had curled into long, brittle ribbons. The TV, a bulky zenith, was still facing the bed. And on top of the TV sat something that shouldn't have been there. A fresh, uncracked VHS tape in a plastic case without dust, labeled only with a date written in felt-tip marker, OCT 122024. The county clerk logged the tape into evidence. 48 hours later, the evidence room camera caught a brief blackout, less than 2 seconds. When the lights returned, the tape was no longer in its bin. The clerk found it the next morning, placed neatly on his desk, rewound to the very start. A regional investigative team was pulled in. They didn't release the footage publicly, but one of the technicians leaked the first page of the internal assessment. The note described faint audio beneath the static something like fabric dragging against concrete, a door hinge under pressure, and a voice too muffled to decipher, except for one repeated fragment that came through intermittently. Not the same room. 3 days later, a second tape surfaced on the doorstep of the shuttered motel office. Same handwriting. Same date. The building is now under restricted access, though no one officially claims jurisdiction over it. The property manager refuses to sleep on site. The county sheriff placed a patrol car in the lot for one night, but by morning, the deputy reported missing time and refused to return. Maintenance crews won't step inside the threshold of room 108. The investigative team has decided to publish the unclassified portions of their findings. What follows is their chronological reconstruction of events tied to the reappearance of the room's interior, the 2 tapes, and the unusual physical conditions recorded during the week in question. Wind pushed dust across the parking lot in thin lines, making the gravel settle in small migrating ridges. A loose strip of aluminum siding tapped against the office window like a cautious knuckle. The deputy assigned to overnight watch stood near room 108's entrance, jotting notes when he heard the doorframe give a muted, rhythmic creak 3 slow pulses, as if something inside the room was adjusting its weight. He stepped closer. The smell reached him first, dry plaster mixed with something faintly metallic, like the interior of an unplugged freezer. His flashlight beam cut across the threshold. The carpet was still matted from decades of neglect, but the pattern of flattened fibers had shifted. Earlier, the maintenance worker had photographed a clean rectangle of dust beneath the TV stand. Now that rectangle showed a single disrupted track, narrow, dragging from the bed toward the bathroom. He crouched. The fibers weren't pressed down by a boot or shoe. They looked pulled, disturbed by something low and steady, like a suitcase sliding across the floor. He noted it, then looked up at the TV. The Zenith's power cord, which the team had wrapped and taped 2 days earlier, now hung loose, draped over the edge as if recently moved. At 2:11 a.m., his body camera caught a faint click from the bathroom. Not a door latch more like porcelain cooling after use. The deputy raised his flashlight, but the beam flickered. The bulbs in the parking lot blinked out for a heartbeat, plunging the building into a washed-out blue darkness. When the lights returned, the deputy found something positioned against the inside of the doorway. A small object leaned upright, perfectly centered. A motel key tag from the 80s, the kind embossed with block numbers. 108. The brass key hanging from it was unoxidized, clean, new. He recognized the tag from the clerk's archive photos. The original had been sealed in a cardboard evidence envelope. Yet the envelope, later checked, remained undisturbed. The deputy stepped back, pulse climbing. The hallway air changed temperature by a few degrees, not colder, just heavier, like the pressure inside the room shifted without wind or movement. He held his breath and listened. Something brushed the interior wall, a soft movement of fabric, a sound so intimate and close it made his knees tense. He radioed dispatch for status confirmation. Static overwhelmed the return signal. When the noise cleared, the deputy stared again at the key. It now lay flat, turned 90 degrees, pointing toward the bathroom. He didn't touch it. He only recorded it. And as he stepped into the open air of the parking lot, he caught a final detail. The door frame, warped and dulled before, now sat perfectly straight, as if someone had forced it back into alignment from the inside. Rain swept over the highway in uneven sheets, drumming against the motel's roof with the dull weight of wet sand. The investigators set up their temporary workstation in the old laundry room, where the hum of portable dehumidifiers masked the intermittent clicking that traveled through the ventilation ducts. A second tape waited on a metal cart, its black plastic case beading with moisture, as if it had been left outside longer than the report claimed. The lead technician, Marla Hensley, checked the timestamp on the security feed. No vehicle had approached the motel that night. No footsteps on gravel. Yet at 4:32 a.m., the office door locked with the chain eased open 3 inches, just enough space for something to be placed inside. The camera caught only the door moving and then settling back into place. Marla lifted the tape. The handwriting on the label was identical to the first, with the same slight downward tilt in the 2 of 2024. She wore cotton gloves, noting the odd warmth of the cassette. It felt recently handled, but not by anyone present. They fed the tape into a refurbished VCR. The machine pulled the ribbon taut, and the screen brightened in uneven pulses. Static rolled in long, shallow waves instead of the usual random scatter. Behind the static, faint patterns emerged, stacked shadows, shifting vertical bands, something that might have been the silhouette of a door. Marla paused, adjusted the tracking, and resumed. The image sharpened by a fraction. The banding resolved into the outline of room 108's interior, but the angle was wrong. It wasn't the layout they had documented. The bed looked farther from the window. The closet door was missing, and the bathroom entrance appeared narrower, as if captured in a room built from memory rather than physical dimensions. Then a sound broke through the interference, a slow scrape across an uneven surface. Not the motel's carpet. This had texture, like cloth moving over concrete. Another tone followed, short and pressured, as if someone were exhaling through their teeth while lifting an object. At the 042 mark, the frame tilted. The horizon line shifted, and for a moment, the camera seemed to be lying sideways on the floor. A thin shape crossed the lower edge of the view, something like a sleeve or pant leg, but too close to distinguish. Marla leaned in, replayed the section, slowed it. The shape moved with a dragging hitch, the same pattern the deputy had recorded in the dust by the bed. When the image steadied, they saw a corner of the room that did not exist in any map or record, a recess between 2 walls with no corresponding structure in the real motel. The recess was deep, darker than the surrounding static, its edges too straight to be noise. Within it, faint reflections pulsed at irregular intervals, like metallic surfaces catching a distant light. Marla froze the frame. The reflections changed even while paused, shifting in a way that made no sense. She checked the monitor, checked the player, checked the tape spools. Everything was mechanically sound. A low hum vibrated through the room, not from the equipment, but from the walls themselves. Dust loosened from the ceiling vent and spiraled in a slow, descending pattern. One of the dehumidifiers clicked off for no apparent reason. The lights dimmed to half voltage, holding there as if the building were bracing against an unseen weight. Then the tape stopped on its own, not at the end mid-reel. The VCR ejected it with a clipped mechanical thud. On the label, the ink of the date had smeared, just slightly. Only the 8 in 108. As Marla reached for the cassette, she noticed something else. A small indentation on the case. A gentle curve that matched the exact outline of an old motel key tag. A cold draft pressed through the seams of the laundry room door, carrying the smell of damp wood and something older, like wet cardboard kept too long in a basement. Marla followed the draft into the main hallway, her steps echoing in an oddly delayed rhythm, as if the building answered half a beat after each footfall. The fluorescence buzzed overhead. One tube stuttered, casting a brief strobe down the corridor. Room 108's door hung slightly open again. No one had touched it since the deputy's report. The latch was still intact, but it rested against the strike plate with a loose, imprecise fit, as though the door no longer matched the frame it had been built for. Marla clicked on her portable recorder and stepped closer. The carpet along the hallway had shifted texture. Instead of the flattened, brittle pile from decades of neglect, a narrow strip running toward 108 appeared recently compressed, the fibers bent in a consistent direction, like the path of something dragged with careful repetition. She crouched to inspect it. Her breath fogged faintly in the stale air. The strip continued beneath the door into the dark, and she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A sliver of light that pulsed at irregular intervals, soft and diffused, coming from somewhere deeper in the room. She pushed the door wider. The hinges moved without resistance, too smoothly for hardware untouched since the 80s. Inside, the air felt layered warm near the floor, cooler at shoulder height, dense near the ceiling. The TV, unplugged and silent, reflected a faint glow that didn't come from any fixture. Marla swept her flashlight across the room. The bed had shifted position, only by inches, but enough to expose a strip of unstained floor where the frame had once rested. A small piece of fabric lay there pale, frayed, caught on the corner of the metal leg. She picked it up. It wasn't cotton. It had the stiff texture of an old uniform collar. Something clicked from the far wall. Not the bathroom this time. The drywall itself made the sound, like two panels settling against each other. Marla approached. The wall had a subtle bow she hadn't noticed during the initial survey. A shallow inward curve that ran from the baseboard to the midpoint of the plaster. She pressed her palm flat against it. The wall felt warm. A second click followed, lower, near the floor. She knelt and ran her hand along the baseboard. There, between two sections of molding, a thin seam pulsed with faint, almost imperceptible shifts of pressure. Her recorder captured the sound. Fabric brushing, something sliding, a small weight repositioning with slow, deliberate intent. Then the pressure beneath her hand released. The seam widened just enough to reveal darkness behind it, an empty space she knew shouldn't exist. Records showed no crawl space, no access cavity, no utility run between the studs of 108's outer wall. But the void was there, swallowing the beam of her flashlight in a heavy, matte black. A shape moved inside. Not a figure, just the hint of mass adjusting itself, like a duffel bag settling after being nudged. She leaned closer. The air from the cavity smelled different from the room. Cold, chemical, with a faint trace of plastic film and dust that hadn't seen light in decades. Something scraped lightly against the interior surface. Marla pulled back, instinct overriding curiosity. She replaced the molding with a firm press. The seam closed, flush and silent, as though the wall had never opened. She turned to exit the room, but the hallway outside no longer aligned with the threshold. The corridor seemed narrower by a few inches, the wallpaper pattern slightly skewed, as if the building had shifted around her without noise or vibration. The deputy appeared at the far end, his silhouette framed in the dimming fluorescent glow. He didn't speak. He only pointed to the floor near her feet. Another key tag lay there. Identical brass, identical numbering. But this one read 109. The storm clouds had pulled low over the interstate, muting every color into shades of wet concrete. Inside the motel, the power wavered again. A soft tremor ran through the floorboards beneath room 108, just enough to make the dust ripple in circular patterns. Marla and the deputy regrouped at the doorway. The new key tag sat between them on the carpet, bright brass catching the hallway's sickly light. Room 109 hadn't existed in decades. The motel had been remodeled in 1986, collapsing 2 adjacent units into storage. Yet the tag felt authentic lettering, the exact style used before the renovation, weight matching the archived logs. The deputy stepped back. His boot pressed into the carpet, and the floor beneath him answered with a hollow tap. Marla knelt to check it. The carpet lifted easily where the adhesive had dried to brittle flakes. Underneath was plywood warped, stained, and in one section, visibly different, new, pale wood with modern screws. She pried gently with a multi-tool. The board flexed. A thin puff of cold air pressed through the gap, followed by a distant sound, rhythmic and slow. Not machinery, not pipes. Something dragging with a controlled pattern, as if being pulled along a rough surface at steady intervals. The deputy held his flashlight low. The beam caught movement inside the exposed space, a brief gleam, like a reflective stripe on older luggage. Then the board settled back into place, flattening as though pushed from below. Marla checked her recorder. The audio displayed spikes during the drag sounds, but the waveform carried an irregular oscillation, as if it had captured not just sound, but the movement of air inside a confined structure. She replayed it. Under the mechanical scrape came a softer tone, like a zipper being eased open inch by inch. A faint knock sounded behind them. They turned. The bathroom door in 108 had closed itself. It now sat flush in the frame, though Marla was certain she'd left it half open. The handle twitched once, not turning, just a small metallic shiver. The deputy crossed the room, tested the knob. It didn't budge. Marla approached slowly. Beneath the door, a paper-thin line of darkness wavered with inconsistent depth, as if the floor inside dipped farther than it should. She dropped to one knee. Her flashlight beam touched the gap. For a moment, she saw tile-old, yellowed, cracked. Then the darkness deepened and smothered the reflection. She stood and listened. The dragging below the floorboards stopped. A single click followed from inside the bathroom, sharper than before. Something like a latch snapping into place. The deputy stepped back toward the doorway. His radio crackled with static, then cleared, carrying an unfamiliar voice unsteady, thin, as though recorded decades earlier on cheap magnetic tape. Still moving it. Not the same room. Not the same. The message cut abruptly. The radio went dead. Marla's recorder, still running, caught a final scrape under the floor, directly beneath her feet. Then the entire room exhaled walls, shifting with a soft internal groan, the temperature rising by several degrees in one warm, steady wave. When the pressure settled, they noticed the new detail on the floor beside the bed. A thin trail of plaster dust leading toward the hall, stopping exactly where room 109 would have started if the motel still had that room. Wind rattled the bent gutter outside the motel, sending a faint metallic clatter through the walls. Inside the makeshift workstation, the monitors flickered in a staggered sequence, each screen dimming for half a second before stabilizing. Marla scanned the drives, storing the digital transfers of both tapes. One folder pulsed with an alert, dozens of missing frames flagged in red. The files had been intact the night before. Now, each tape contained new irregular gaps, as if entire seconds had been lifted out and replaced with compressed static. The missing portions aligned perfectly with the moments they had witnessed something shifting in the room. The glint in the recess, the sideways tilt of the camera, the zipper-like sound. It wasn't random corruption. It was curated. The deputy scrolled through the logs, brow tight. During the exact second the frames vanished, a separate feed from the hallway camera recorded a brief anomaly. The door to room 108 swung fully open for one frame, then returned to its previous position the next. No blur, no transition. Open, closed, as though two separate states had been stitched into the timeline. Marla rewound the altered segment. At quarter speed, between blocks of static, the shadow of the room's interior, warped walls stretching slightly, the bed frame shifting angle. A faint beam of light passed across the camera, the kind created by an open door in a dark space. Except no one had entered. She enhanced the audio. Underneath the static, something rhythmic emerged. 3 soft impacts, spaced evenly. Not steps more, like the sound of a heavy object being set down, repositioned, and set down again. Each impact accompanied by a brief flutter in the waveform, suggesting the room's internal pressure fluctuated in response. The deputy switched to the live hallway feed. Room 108's door moved again, an almost invisible realignment, its top edge shifting a fraction of an inch, as though pulled by tension inside the doorframe. He stepped out to check it physically. Marla followed. The hallway felt narrower again. The air moved with a gentle suction, as if the motel were breathing through unseen vents. They reached 108. The door stood perfectly still, but when the deputy pressed a hand to it, he exhaled sharply. It was warm. Not from sunlight. There were no windows in the hallway. Warm like the heat of a machine running behind the wall. Marla noticed the carpet at the threshold had changed texture again. The fibers now slanted toward the interior, as if brushed repeatedly across the same path. She knelt to inspect a deeper indentation near the hinge. It resembled the impression of something rested there for long periods, something with weight and a rounded edge. She brushed the fibers back. Beneath them lay a fine scratch in the floorboard. Then another, parallel, pulled inward, drag marks. They followed the marks into the room. The pattern crossed the floor in a straight line toward the bathroom door, then abruptly broke off, curving toward the far wall where the secret seam had appeared earlier. The molding there showed no sign of tampering. Flush, even, undisturbed. Then a dull thud sounded from behind it. Not loud, but unmistakably close. Marla pressed her ear to the wall. Fabric shifted. A faint inhale, slow and shallow. Something repositioned itself deeper inside the cavity. She stepped back. The molding bowed outward by the smallest measurable degree, as if whatever occupied the space behind it had shifted its weight toward the opening. Moments later, the corridor lights dimmed again. But this time, they didn't return to full brightness. They held at a low, trembling glow that turned the entire hallway the color of a dying nightlight. The deputy radioed for backup. Only white noise answered. Then the radio clicked once, a solitary, deliberate pulse. Not static, a signal from inside the building. A low tremor rolled through the hallway, gentle enough that the dust on the baseboards shivered without lifting. The motel's foundation gave a soft internal pop, like aging wood adjusting under a new weight. Marla steadied herself against the wall, feeling the warmth pulsing through it in slow waves. The deputy stepped backward, eyes on the molding where the thud had come from. The brass key tags lay in his other hand, 108 and 109, both warm to the touch, as if they'd been carried in someone's pocket only moments earlier. He slipped them into an evidence pouch, but the plastic fogged from the inside almost immediately. The seam in the wall appeared again. Not a full opening, just a slender, breathing line. The pressure behind it tightened and released in small intervals, like a slow heartbeat. Marla crouched, recorder still running. The air from the gap spilled out in cold pulses, carrying the scent of old tape reels, wet fabric, and the faint sting of rusted metal. The deputy whispered for her to step back, but she leaned closer. Inside the gap, something shifted, a soft, deliberate movement. Then came the sound they both recognized. A zipper drawn halfway, teeth clicking apart. It stopped suddenly, replaced by the steady brushing of cloth dragged across a hard surface. Marla pressed her flashlight beam into the seam. For a moment, the light seemed swallowed by the darkness. Then the cavity revealed itself. A narrow space between walls where no architectural cavity should exist, stretching further than the building's exterior would allow. Near the back of the void sat an object. A video cassette, no label, no date, dustless, positioned upright as if recently placed there. Next to it lay something else, a cloth sleeve, the kind used to protect old portable cameras. It was collapsed inward, folded by weight or pressure from something that had once been inside. Before Marla could reach for the tape, a new sound emerged, 3 rhythmic knocks, not from the cavity, but from the bathroom, the locked bathroom. The deputy's hand went instinctively to his holster. He approached the door slowly, stopping inches from the handle. The knocks came again, softer this time, each one carrying a faint echo as though struck inside a much larger space. Marla stood behind him. She noticed the tiles beneath the bathroom threshold had darkened, as if moisture had seeped through from below, but when she touched one, it felt warm. The knob turned a fraction of a degree on its own, not enough to open, just enough to reveal tension behind the door, as if someone or something held it from the inside and misjudged the resistance. The deputy stepped back, and the hallway twisted. Only slightly, almost imperceptibly, just enough that the straight line of doors bowed inward, as if the corridor were being pulled toward a focal point deep inside the structure. The air grew heavier. Their breaths shortened. The molding at the cavity trembled and then sealed shut in a single smooth motion, becoming featureless wall again. The bathroom door, now motionless, gave a quiet click from the inside. Marla and the deputy exchanged a single look before retreating into the hallway. As they reached the threshold, Marla glanced back at room 108. The bed had moved. Only by inches, but now it angled toward the wall where the cavity had opened, aligned perfectly with the length of the drag marks. Dust lay in a fresh arc on the carpet, marking a path toward the door as if the bed had been pivoted by precise, methodical force. The deputy exhaled slowly. His radio crackled, and then the same faint voice returned, the one they had heard earlier, the one buried beneath the tape's static, still moving it. Rooms not the same. Rooms not. The transmission cut off with a dry snap. They turned toward the exit. Halfway down the corridor, Marla stopped. Another key tag lay in the center of the floor. Brass, untarnished, heavy, no number stamped on it. Just a blank plate, smooth and waiting. The rain finally stopped. In its absence, the motel settled into a deeper quiet, the kind that made every small sound stand out like a warning. The blank key tag rested in Marla's hand, colder than the hallway air. The deputy watched the far end of the corridor as if expecting it to contract again. They moved together, slow, deliberate. The building felt unstable, not from structural damage, but from internal tension, like a space bending around something it wasn't designed to hold. When they reached the workstation, the monitors were already awake. Every screen displayed the same image, a live feed from room 108. Only one camera had been angled that way, But 4 separate monitors showed it now, each with slight variations in brightness and framing, as if the system couldn't decide which version of the room was correct. In all 4 feeds, the bed continued drifting. Not fast, not animated, just slightly misaligned each time the frames refreshed an inch here, a tilt there, the headboard shifting closer to the wall that had hidden the cavity. Marla stepped closer. In one feed, a shadow crossed the lower corner of the image. Not a figure, just a darkened mass, the shape of an object sliding across the carpet. In another feed, the bathroom door stood half open. In a third, it was closed. In the fourth, the door wasn't visible at all, replaced by a blank section of wall. The room wasn't changing. The recordings were disagreeing with each other. The deputy backed away, scanning the hardware. We should leave. Now. But Marla leaned toward the feed, showing the half-open bathroom. Something inside the doorway shimmered faintly specular reflections on a curved metal surface, the kind from the edge of a camera lens. She froze the feed. The reflection persisted. Someone had been recording from inside the bathroom. She stepped away from the monitors, pulse tight in her throat. Something about that reflection, its position, its angle matched the type of old shoulder-mounted cameras used in the 80s. She thought of the cloth sleeve they'd seen in the cavity. The indentation shaped like equipment stored too long in one place. The motel lights flickered again. But this time, instead of dimming, they surged brighter, far brighter than the circuits could safely output. The fluorescence buzzed with a rising whine. Dust drifted upward from the floorboards, as if carried by a slow vacuum. Then room 108's door slammed shut. The sound shook the entire hallway. The deputy drew his sidearm, eyes on the door. The latch snapped into place with a sharp metallic bite. Marla approached cautiously. The blank key tag warmed in her fist. She pressed her ear to the door. Inside, she heard movement, something being dragged with steady rhythm, scraping floor and wall, repositioning itself in short, deliberate stages. She stepped back and lifted the key tag. The deputy grabbed her arm. Don't. But the door handle turned on its own, a soft click. A breath of warm air slipping through the seam. The scent of old tape, wet plaster, rusted hinges. The door eased open. Only an inch, enough to see the floor. The bed was no longer where it had been. It now sat flush against the far wall right, where the cavity had once, open pressed so tightly that the metal frame bowed inward. Something lay beneath it. Not a person, not an animal, just an object, dragged into perfect alignment with the bed frame. A third tape, unlabeled, new plastic, edges sharp, as if molded that morning. Marla struck the lights with her flashlight. For a fraction of a second, she saw the outline of the cavity behind the wall. No seam, no molding, just the suggestion of space where space shouldn't exist. Then the bed shifted again, an inch outward. The tape slid slightly, as if nudged from behind. The deputy pulled her away from the doorway. They backed down the corridor, steps sinking with the rhythmic scrape inside the room. When they reached the far end, the motel gave a single long exhale, walls flexing, floor settling, air thickening into a low, heavy pressure. Every door down the corridor clicked at once, and several others the motel hadn't contained in decades. One by one, the lock mechanisms aligned. Marla stared down at the blank key tag in her hand. As the pressure in the building eased, shallow dust trails formed along the hallway floor, thin lines drawn toward a point deeper in the motel, leading into a corridor that hadn't existed when they arrived. The blank tag flexed slightly in her palm, warming as if responding to the alignment. The deputy whispered her name, but she didn't move. The dust trails lengthened. The new corridor darkened. Somewhere inside it, something continued dragging, steady, patient, rearranging the rooms. They stepped backward toward the exit. But Marla looked over her shoulder one last time. At the far end of the new corridor, barely visible in the darkness, a door flickered into focus. Its number plate glowed faintly. No digits, just a blank brass rectangle, waiting.